Welcome to Pushback. I'm Aaron Maté. Jeremy Corbyn's tenure as Labour Party leader recently came to an end. Corbyn, a staunch progressive and lifelong activist, stepped down just months after Labour's crushing defeat in the December 2019 UK elections. But now new details are emerging on how Corbyn was sabotaged from the inside. A Labour Party investigation found that top Labour officials actually tried to lose the 2017 general election in the hopes such a loss could lead to Corbyn's ouster. This faction set up a secret working group that diverted money into right-wing Labour candidates instead of Corbyn's allies. Their sabotage efforts failed at the time. With Corbyn at the helm, Labour overturned the Conservative majority, posted the largest popular vote gain since 1945, and came just a few thousand votes shy of winning that 2017 general election. As Labour supporters celebrated their gains on the night of that vote, the anti-Corbyn officials inside Labour sulked. One official wrote, quote, "They are cheering and we are silent and gray-faced, opposite to what I had been working towards for the last couple of years," unquote. Overall, the report concludes that a, quote, "abnormal intensity of factional opposition to the party leader, Corbyn, had inhibited the proper functioning of the Labour Party bureaucracy." The report also suggests that the same people who tried to undermine Corbyn were themselves the ones who were slow to respond to allegations of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party ranks. The so-called anti-Semitism crisis inside Labour was used as another weapon to undermine Corbyn's leadership. Well, to discuss this, I spoke earlier with Asa Winstanley, a journalist with the Electronic Intifada. Asa has been a vocal critic of the allegations of anti-Semitism inside the party, calling the scandal a manufactured crisis that was used to purge the party of pro-Palestinian sentiment and to weaken Jeremy Corbyn's leadership as it did. Asa himself was caught up in the investigation and resigned from the Labour Party as a result. Asa Winstanley, welcome to Pushback. Let me start by asking you your overall reaction to this report, what it tells us, in your view, about how top-level officials inside Labour view Jeremy Corbyn, and how this so-called anti-Semitism crisis played into that.
Well, hi, Aaron. It's great to be with you. I think the report shows two main things overall. It's a huge document. I've just finished reading the whole thing yesterday. 851 pages. It's incredibly turgid. Like there's a lot of repetition, a lot of getting into unnecessary detail. But in essence, it shows a great amount of evidence that Labour Party bureaucrats, its full-time staff, supposedly politically neutral between Labour Party's factions, were actually rabidly right-wing. They were from the hard right of the party, and they were adamantly opposed to Jeremy Corbyn from the beginning, and they worked actively to undermine him from day one, even going to the lengths of actually actively sabotaging the Labour Party's general election campaign in 2017. And I saw Corbyn said recently, it was reported that Corbyn recently said that he would be Prime Minister and he would have won the 2017 general election without the attempts of the parliamentary Labour Party, its MPs, to undermine him. And I think this report gives further evidence of that. In essence, this aspect is what a lot of us knew at the time. And I was looking today back at one of my reports from 2017. That's what I was reporting at the time. And some of us in the online left-wing media, including the Squawk Box website, were reporting the same thing, that Labour Party staff were working actively to undermine Jeremy Corbyn. And it's really, so this was known, and it's a shame that Corbyn didn't do anything against it at the time. He just eventually waited for these people to get sick of it, sick of the fight, and leave the party, as many of them seem to do in 2018. The second thing that it shows is in also quite depressing amount of detail is just how much the Labour Party, under both right wing and left wing rule, has acceded to demands by the Israel lobby, essentially, that it has in indulged and embraced this false narrative of Labour Party members and the left and Palestine solidarity in particular of being anti-Semitic, of being riven with anti-Semitism, of being, this nest of scum and villainy, and of just being horrible racists. And this was a narrative that was used to attack Corbyn from the beginning, but increasingly came to be more and more targeted at the leadership the membership in general. And we saw, especially from 2018 onwards, Corbyn began to really accede to these demands, and we started to see the Labour Party membership going down, and that resulted last year in the defeat of Jeremy Corbyn in the general election. So it was ultimately a self-defeating strategy. It was a major, there was a number of factors for the general election defeat, but the most underplayed one, in my view, was Jeremy Corbyn and the people around him, their mishandling of the anti-Semitism smear campaign. And there's polling data to indicate there was a major poll that came out after the general election, which showed that Labour's mishandling of so-called anti-Semitism was one of the top 5 reasons that voters didn't vote for Jeremy Corbyn. Because by constantly apologising for anti-Semitism and saying that, we've got this terrible problem in the Labour Party, Corbyn really undermined himself. And again, despite this document, which I should clarify, was very much written by the left wing of the party bureaucracy, which eventually started to come in after 2018. This document shows, again, actually, despite what it's arguing, the number of genuine cases of real anti-Semitism amongst Labour Party membership, it's minuscule. There's Labour. You've got to remember the Labour Party at one point. It's gone down now, but at one point it was a party of 600,000 people. This is the biggest political party in Western Europe, and it was a mass movement. It was a mass membership party. So of course people, it reflects society at large, and including the prejudices of society. So it's inevitable that a mass membership party is going to have some forms of racism in it, and instead of conducting sensible, education and whatnot against such forms of prejudice, the Labour Party began to execute a purge of anyone suspected of the merest whiff of anti-Semitism, and that campaign spilled over into a persecution of anti-Zionists. And there's prominent sections in this report on prominent supporters of Jeremy Corbyn who were expelled or suspended from the Labour Party and actually didn't do anything wrong or say anything anti-Semitic, including people like Jackie Walker, Ken Livingstone, Chris Williamson, and Mark Wadsworth.
So there's 2 elements here. There is the hostility towards Corbyn from top officials, and then there's the role that you're talking about there, about how they use this anti-Semitism, the so-called anti-Semitism crisis against Corbyn. And it's going back to 2017, to that election. And you see it in these leaked chat logs where these top officials are upset that Jeremy Corbyn has come so close to winning Labour's highest gains in a few decades, and just something like 2,500 votes shy from actually forming a government. So just to read that is quite striking. But now you're also saying, though, that it also actually undermines the claim that anti-Semitism was a genuine crisis inside Labour. So before we get into your own personal brush with that, because you were caught up in this, you were targeted by it, what do you think accounts for why the people inside Labour and outside Labour decided to make it such a big issue? And what do you think accounts for Jeremy Corbyn's failure to, according to your criticism, properly push back on it?
Well, just one point on the election stuff that you mentioned before I get into that issue. It is really, that stuff is really quite astonishing. And there's one I've just written. I'm about to file an article for the Electronic Intifada about this, and it does show how imagine the Labour Party's own staff were actively working to lose the general election for the Labour Party. And there's one part of the document which shows that there was around possibly more than £200,000 budgeted for what they were called a secret key seats target list. So in other words, these right-wing bureaucrats were aiming to support only the right-wing candidates in right-wing MPs, right-wing Labour MPs against the left-wing pro-Labour Corbyn MPs in the Labour Party, who were a minority in any case. But something that the report's authors miss is that several of the people on this. Several of these right-wing candidates who were working to undermine Jeremy Corbyn publicly during the general election campaign included members of the Israel lobby, who included people who within the Labour Party, MPs in the Labour Party, or prospective MPs in some cases, who were leading figures in the Labour Friends of Israel and the Jewish Labour movement, especially Joan Ryan, who was an MP, and Jeremy Newmark, who was a candidate but failed to win the seat. So there's no evidence of it, direct evidence of it in the report. It doesn't say who was on the secret key seats list, but I would imagine it would have included Ryan and Newmark. As to what accounts for the failure of Jeremy Corbyn and the people around him to get to grips with this, it's a range of issues. It's at the bottom, in my view, lies a weak analysis of the nature of Israel and the nature of Zionism. That what it comes down to is the argument that Zionism can have left-wing forms, and that there are non-racist versions of Zionism. But this kind of analysis ignores the reality of what Zionism means for the Palestinian people. It means a racist state that systematically discriminates against them in law and in practice. As much as we are opposed to a white state or Christian state, we should be opposed to a Jewish state as well. So it's really a very weak analysis of Zionism is what lies at the bottom of it. Also, I think there is an aspect.
What does that matter? What Jeremy Corbyn and the people around him might think about Zionism? I don't see actually the relevance here.
It matters because of groups like Labour Friends of Israel and the Jewish Labour Movement, which are Zionist groups, self-defined Zionist groups, and they are within the orbit of the Labour Party, although Labour Friends of Israel technically is not affiliated to the Labour Party. But it's certainly seen as, they were seen as groups which, are within the Labour Party. So those people were trusted by Jeremy Corbyn. The Labour Friends of Israel and the Jewish Labour Movement were trusted by Jeremy Corbyn and by the people around him, within the Labour Party, and they were seen as part of the Labour Party family. But the whole time they were working actively to undermine him. They were working actively to undermine the membership, but he kept acceding to their demands over and over again. And it didn't matter how many concessions he made to them, they kept publicly attacking him. So in this report, time and time again, they say the authors are trying to prove how much they've done to try and take on the views of the Jewish Labour Movement and even the Labour Friends of Israel, and all the while ignoring the fact that so many allegations of anti-Semitism from these two groups were politically motivated and false. They were attacking people like Ken Livingstone because he was on the left of the party, because he supported Palestinian rights. And what they're trying to essentially infiltrate their views, or their pro-Zionist views, into the Labour Party, and to get them passed through, and to get a kind of hegemony within the Labour Party, political hegemony within the Labour Party for these pro-Israel views, under the guise of combating anti-Semitism and mixing the two things together. So that's why it matters, in my view.
I get all that. I'm just saying is I don't claim to know what Jeremy Corbyn's own personal view of Zionism is, and it just seems to me immaterial. I mean, certainly we agree that the use of anti-Semitism here was totally dishonest, disingenuous, and cynical. And Jeremy Corbyn's failure to effectively push back on it and to call it out as basically a scam, I think was a huge mistake. I guess I take issue with assuming that that's because Jeremy Corbyn has a soft, in your opinion, view of Zionism.
I mean, that seems to me part of the reason for it. I mean, I think also part of the reason was just a general failure to and a general failure to get to grips with it, and of this manufactured crisis, and just a general political weakness of not wanting to be attacked, because it's a controversial area, so when you're being, he was already in an isolated position. He had very few friends, especially at the beginning, and still, even towards all the way through, right up to the December election until the end, the pro-Corbyn MPs in the Labour Party were very much in the minority. The majority of them were opposed to him, if not actively hostile and openly hostile. So he was already isolated on a number of issues, and it was probably his history within the pro-Palestine, within the Palestine solidarity movement. It seemed eventually became an embarrassment to him, which is a real shame. I don't want to leap down someone's throat and say that they sold out, but the record is very clear that he seemed to change his views, or if his views didn't change, he made it appear previously in the past that they were more serious than they in fact were. I mean, for example, he wasn't just someone who would turn up for the odd demonstration, in favor of Palestinian rights. He was the chair of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. He was in the past, he was one of a very incredibly small number of MPs who would come to Palestine Solidarity Campaign meetings and meetings of other Palestine Solidarity groups. It's changed now. There are more who are a bit more willing to come. But in the past, he was one of very few MPs. I've shared platforms with him in the past, and then that was the very fact that I did that was then resurrected by these shady Bellingcat types online, I believe a year or two back, to kind of an attempt to discredit Jeremy Corbyn. It's a kind of divide and rule strategy, right, of the left, to try and say, well, look, it's a very Israeli sort of strategy. Not that I'm saying everyone who did it was an Israeli, but this is literally an Israeli government strategy. Is what they called, what's the Israeli think tank, the Reut Institute, called driving a wedge and isolating the delegitimizers from the so-called soft critics of Israel. And that's very much what we've seen over the last few years in the Labour Party.
I got that. And I think it's fine to criticize Jeremy Corbyn and to, identify areas where he didn't effectively push back on this, and he let it consume, he let it get way too big. To the extent that he could have had any impact on the outcome. But at the same time, not having had in my lifetime a Western political leader as prominent as him, who, wears a keffiyeh in public and goes to demonstrations and marches next to banners condemning Israeli war crimes, I have a hard time, I guess, with the criticism that he abandoned his principles, because I never saw him abandon those principles, abandon those critiques of Israel. I just saw him being relatively ineffectual ineffective or weak in the face of a smear campaign, which to me is, I think, a separate issue than his commitment to Palestinian rights.
I'm not sure that he abandoned his principles, but I certainly think that he changed. I mean, an activist that I talked to who knew him, before he became leader of the Labour Party, Labour Party activists, and Palestine Solidarity Campaign activists, over the years, there was many people who I talked to who privately, they wouldn't go on the record with me, but privately expressed a lot of misgivings over the direction he was taking. I mean, to be honest, I was probably in retrospect a bit too easy on Corbyn. Like, I should have attempted to report on this a little bit more as long ago as 2016 or 2017. There would be meetings that he would no longer go to. There'd be events, Palestine Solidarity events, especially at Labour Party conferences and so forth, that he would no longer go to. And there was rumblings about this. And I think people were very tolerant of that because they realised he was a leader of the UK's main opposition party and he had new responsibilities and he wasn't going to have time to do all the things that he necessarily wanted to do. I think that people definitely saw a change of tack from him in that regard, and there's some evidence of that in the document in this report, because and this is something I'm going to write about, that I've written about, how he essentially turned against Ken Livingstone, who is one of his very few political allies within the sort of top ranks of the Labour Party.
The former mayor of London.
That's right. He was a former MP, and then later the elected mayor of London, the first properly elected political mayor of London, who had an immense amount of power, and he was someone very much on the anti-imperialist left. He forged links with Hugo Chavez. He was very, very much critical of the Israeli violations of Palestinian human rights, Israeli war crimes, and so forth. And he was someone who for years was attacked by the Israel lobby and demonized as anti-Semitic when it was absolutely not true. And he was a political ally, one of Corbyn's few political allies. He was kind of retired from frontline politics when Corbyn came to prominence as the leader of the Labour Party. But he still had a national profile and he had access to the mainstream media. One of only a handful of pro-Corbyn figures at that time who had access to the mainstream media. And Livingstone was politically assassinated by the right of the Labour Party in collusion with the Israel lobby. Corbyn did nothing. He really kind of let it happen. I think a lot of us who reported on that and who were critical of that at the time and since just thought, or even better wishful thinking, judged that Corbyn was just too weak to. He was in such a weak position to do anything about it. But there is some indication in these leaks that he and his office were actually pushing for the disciplinary measures against Ken Livingstone to be sped up, and that there was negotiations between it. There's emails in it that very much seem to show that there was negotiations between Ken Livingstone and Corbyn's office for Ken Livingstone to quit the Labour Party instead of the Inquisition against Ken being just continuing and dragging on, which is what he ultimately did. He did quit the Labour Party in the end.
So that's a case where you might have Corbyn and his people thinking that if they sacrifice some allies, that might take some of the heat off of them.
Yeah, and that is very much what happened. But the problem was that, and I think even a lot of us at the time probably thought, oh, well, he's in a difficult position, et cetera, et cetera. But the problem with that is there was no end to it. There was one person after another, and it kept the story dragging and the narrative dragging on and on and on for years and years. Yeah. After Ken, it was there was Jackie Walker, and then there was Mark Wadsworth, who hadn't said anything remotely anti-Semitic or even about Israel. He was just criticizing a right-wing MP who happened to be Jewish. He didn't say anything anti-Semitic, and he was ultimately expelled from the party with the encouragement we learned from this document of Jenny Formby and the Jeremy Corbyn staff, his loyal staff, actually. So there is a lot to answer for in this document.
Well, this is where I've taken a lesson from Russiagate, where, sort of analogously, I was sympathetic to Bernie Sanders for peddling Russiagate, for buying into it, for going along with it, not calling it out, and going along with the impeachment sequel, even though impeachment ended up literally sidelining Bernie Sanders, not just his issues, but also sidelining him physically from campaigning in the key states of Iowa and South Carolina, because he had to be in Washington to hear Adam Schiff present his impeachment case about how we need to arm Ukraine so we're not fighting Russia over here, and idiocy like that. And I'm realizing in retrospect that given that Russiagate was in many ways an effort by the Democratic establishment to blunt the appeal of Bernie Sanders, because Bernie Sanders was the obvious direction to go in after losing in 2016 to an anti-establishment candidate, that Bernie Sanders should not have given it any life, and that he made a mistake on that front. So I've come around on that issue of whether giving any inch to people who are trying to destroy you. And certainly in the case of Corbyn, that lesson very much applies. So let me ask you about your own case, though, Asa, because you were caught up in this. You are mentioned in this report. You were investigated by the Labour Party. Talk to us about what happened to you in all this.
Yes, well, there is a whole section on me in the document, which is kind of amusing in a way that they thought I was significant enough to dedicate that much to me. But what happened was last year at the beginning, about a year ago now, in March 2019, I was suspended from the Labour Party and put under an investigation for tweets I'd written, and essentially, so they sent me this letter and this long list of sort of charges, but the list of charges were a bunch of my tweets, but most of those tweets were things I'd reported about, written about, and reported about. So it wasn't just like I was dashing off some tweet or some insult. I was repeating things that I'd thoroughly investigated, reported on, and had been fact-checked by my editors. So, but they were smearing those things as anti-Semitic. So there's a good example of that, probably a really emblematic example of that in the report itself. It says that Asa Winstanley was suspended following complaints, including that he calling Louise Ellman, Labour Friends of Israel officer Louise Ellman. Now, Louise Ellman she's now quit, she was a Labour MP from the right of the party, and she was the chairperson and an officer of Labour Friends of Israel. I mean, it's just a fact, and that was taken from their website. It wasn't a secret, it was in the open, and it was just an objective fact. She was at the time an officer of the group Labour Friends of Israel, which calls itself Labour Friends of Israel. And it was salient to the point I was making in my tweets, which they've edited out of their report. So yeah, I mean, it's just this kind of smearing of people. I mean, it was emblematic. What they did to me was emblematic of what they did to so many people. And so yeah, I was suspended. My membership was suspended, and there was more than a year. Ultimately, what happened was there was more than a year of I was on investigation and I was suspended, and in the end I quit because they sent me a whole bunch of charges at a certain point, detailed things about my tweets and so forth, and I was called to account for them. Well, what do you mean by this, and so on and so forth. I sent them a long 12-page document responding point by point. I didn't hear anything for months. And then in February this year, I got another letter, and they just sent me a whole bunch of new charges. Some of them were repeating some of the same things, And it just the whole tone of it and what they were writing in that letter convinced me, and after seeking legal advice, convinced me that what they were doing was essentially a political show trial, and it was going to be a foregone conclusion that I was going to be expelled, and that despite the fact they were leading me to believe that there was a process and I was going to be referred to the National Executive Committee and they would hear my case and so on and so forth, I wasn't remotely convinced, and I thought it was a foregone conclusion I would be expelled. And so I quit the party in protest at how they'd handled it, including the fact that they'd actually leaked my private data. They'd leaked the fact that I'd been suspended to a hostile newspaper. And that was the way I found out about it. A reporter from an anti-Palestinian newspaper, the Jewish Chronicle, was the first person to find out about it. I learned about it from her tweet. And this was something the Labour Party did systematically, time and time again, to so many activists over the years. They sent it out to right-wing media, the fact that this person's been suspended, investigated, and it was a way to. And we see that we've seen so much evidence of that. And in the section on me in the report is quite interesting because there's evidence in it that I was absolutely right and my lawyer was right, because it was a foregone conclusion, and it said that it says in this report, this internal party report, that the Labour Party staffers, had actually recommended to the NEC disciplinary panel that I'd be expelled. So they didn't tell that to me when they wrote to me in February. They just said, well, they'll decide what to do, and they have the power. They have power to decide what to do, including suspending, disciplining, or expelling. But this proves that it was a foregone conclusion.
So finally, Jeremy Corbyn recently stepped down as leader after losing the recent election. We have a whole new leadership in charge now. The new Labour leader is already talking about strong support for Israel and taking the so-called anti-Semitism crisis seriously. And meanwhile, just witnessing online the spats between even people who identify as supporters of Corbyn, there's a lot of acrimony, and some people who really took this anti-Semitism thing at face value and didn't see it as the smear campaign that it was, and other people like yourself who didn't. I'm just wondering overall, what has all this done to the actual left in Britain? What has the impact been? And do you see a path forward for, healing all the divisions and getting to a point where Labour is in a position like it was with Corbyn, just literally a few thousand votes, as it was in 2017, away from controlling the government?
Well, that's really big questions, Aaron. I mean, look, it's difficult. Essentially, what's happened in the Labour Party over the last 4.5 years has been a case of divide and rule. And unfortunately, there are far too many people on the left who are in denial about a basic fact. A hostile foreign power, Israel, interfered and is still interfering in British democracy. That is what happened, And the Israeli government, the Israeli state, its embassy and its associated cutouts were involved in undermining Corbyn, in undermining the left, and in undermining the Labour Party grassroots, and essentially trying to groom it in favour of its official state ideology, Zionism. And I've reported on this, and there's just so many examples of it. And we see now, you mentioned Keir Starmer, the new Labour Party leader. He says, I support Zionism without qualification. That's his ideology going forward.
Let me just stop you there, because you don't just blame Israel for Corbyn's demise, though, right? Because obviously the Blair wing of the party, the neoliberals, who Corbyn threatened, obviously they played a huge role in this too.
Yeah, of course. There was a number of factors for his defeat, but I think the interference of the Israel lobby and the Israeli government, often closely associated with them, was a weak area that he was unwilling to fight back against. Like the attacks of the Labour Party right wing, and just some of these more other outlandish media attacks against him. Like they said he was a Czechoslovak spy, for the Czech Communist Party in the past or whatever. All this and just this kind of outlandish nonsense. There was a big difference because his press people fought back against that stuff. They denounced it and they said, this is a political attack. The Labour anti-Semitism stuff, he didn't fight back against it, for the most part. There was a few instances here and there where there was a little bit of hope that he would or he did, like when he denounced what Benjamin Netanyahu said about some of the things he'd done at certain points. But by and large, he kind of acceded to it. So, we've got this state now where you're right, like the left is really divided against itself. And this is a strategy that Israel has pursued to do. Yes, you're right. It's that, Israel is not behind everything that happened. Absolutely not. But there was a number of factors for the defeat. But the polling data shows that Corbyn's mishandling of the issue, it wasn't just a fringe issue on the right amongst leftists fighting each other, right? It was one of the top five reasons that voters turned against Corbyn, because if he was constantly apologizing for the issue, and it was just people. I think voters actually got sick of the issue, and it was a major factor for his defeat, in my view. So about the way going forward, I don't know. But I know that if the left of any description wants to win in the future, they have to get to grips with this issue. And the fact is an absolute fact that the issue of anti-Semitism is misrepresented, and deliberately false allegations of anti-Semitism are made in order to demonize the left and divide it against itself. So this issue, the lessons from Corbyn's defeat, are going to have to be learned if there's any hope for the future. And I think what the parallel you made with Bernie Sanders is really apt, and it's a really interesting parallel with Russiagate, which is you've done so much good work on, of course. That he kind of acceded to this Russiagate thing in the same way, in a quite similar way that Corbyn acceded to the Labour anti-Semitism smears. In both cases, it ultimately ended up being a self-defeating strategy.
And let me say, for anybody wanting proof, evidence for what Asa is talking about in terms of Israeli lobby interference in British politics, there is a great documentary series made by Al Jazeera called The Lobby, which has undercover footage of Israeli lobbyists doing just that, plotting to and trying to undermine elected politicians who are supportive of Palestinian rights and other roles and other means of direct interference.
Yeah, that's right. If viewers can search for Al Jazeera, The Lobby, and there's a brilliant 4-part film about all of this. It's mainly it's about UK politics in general, but especially focused on what Israel lobbyists and the Israeli embassy were doing to undermine Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party specifically. And there was quite a similar documentary made by Al Jazeera about the US Israel lobby, which
was censored.
Which was censored. They never released it
by the Israel lobby, but leaked.
Yeah, exactly. It was censored after pressure by the Israel lobby,
and published ultimately by the Electronic Intifada.
Yeah, that's right. We and others published it online. You can. So yeah, The Lobby and The Lobby USA, two really important films, which prove so much about what we're saying. In many ways, they show a bit like this leaked Labour document. In many ways, they show things that we kind of knew or suspected, but it's kind of outlined there in black and white, or in living color in the case of the films.
And we'll link to that beneath this segment, as well as your work, Asa Winstanley, investigative journalist for the Electronic Intifada. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Aaron.